Namaste. Welcome to the third edition of the Global Festival of Oneness, organized by Advaita Academy. We will start with a prayer. Sada Shiva Samarambham, Shankaracharya Madhyamam, Asmadacharya Paryantam, Vande Guru-Paramparam. We're very happy to have with us Professor Vishwa Adluri and Dr. Joydeep Bagchee, who are going to talk to us about Text-Historicism and Advaita. Before we start the session, I'd like to introduce the speakers. Vishwaji is a professor in the philosophy department at Hunter College, New York, and the author of over a dozen articles and essays on the Mahabharata. His works mainly focuses on the reception of ancient thought, both Greek and Indian in modernity. He is the author of Parmenides, Plato, and Mortal Philosophy, Return from Transcendence, The Nay Science, A History of German Indology, and Philology and Criticism, A Guide to Mahabharata Textual Criticism. Vishwaji has a PhD in philosophy from the New School of Social Research, New York, a PhD in Indology from Phillips University, Marburg, and a PhD in Sanskrit from Deccan College, Pune. Professor Joydeep Bagchee is Professor Adluri's student and Berlin-based researcher and intellectual historian. He has a PhD from the New School for Social Research, New York, in philosophy. He has studied Indian and Western philosophy and completed a PhD in German philosophy under Dr. Adluri's guidance. He is the co-author of The Nay Science, A History of German Indology, and Philology and Criticism, A Guide to Mahabharata Textual Criticism. Welcome, Professor Adluri and Professor Bagchee.
Thank you.
We'll continue the session. The last 5 minutes we will keep for question answers.
So the first question is, how long do we have to read?
You have 1 hour, around approximately 1 hour. So the last 5 minutes we can keep for. Maybe 55 minutes we can talk, and then we can keep for 5 minutes for questions.
We have written quite a detailed paper, and the rule is double space takes, each double space page takes 2 minutes. And this is about single space 20, so we won't be able to get through the whole thing, but we will read as much as we can, and we'll try and make a break exactly where it sort of makes sense to break and not leave people hanging. I'm going to actually share this by screen because otherwise it's tiring to listen to someone read, and Professor Adluri wants me to sort of center myself because Zoom works better if you're looking directly into it. So I will read, he will be here next to me. If you have questions, you may ask them, and we will then take questions at the end. So let me start by sharing the screen. You have to bear a little with me because I am working with PC and I don't normally do Windows, so I'm a little unfamiliar here. All right, can everyone see this?
Yes,
yeah.
Please.
Okay, so first I want to welcome all of you again. I want to thank Nitinji for organizing this because it's one of the most wonderful series of lectures that has been happening over the past few years. And if those of you who have attended last year's Oneness conference will know that Professor Adluri presented on Shishupala, the Moksha of Shishupala and the Mahabharata. This paper is in continuation of that, but if you have not heard that one, that's still fine because it is focusing on another aspect of it, and we won't get into the concrete interpretation of Shishupala, but it is worth having that story in the back of your mind. All right, now I will begin. This paper is concerned with an appropriate method to approach the Itihasa Purana textual tradition. Since the 19th century, the dominant method in Indology has been text historical criticism, which raises questions about the history of text and the history in text. Such a method investigating facts would properly belong to science as opposed to art or philosophy. The text historical method therefore either stands or fails as a science. Recent work shows the inability of text historical method to be free from prejudice, objective, with criteria that can be clearly defined and defended, and results that can be repeated and independently verified. Interrogated from the perspective of science, text historical method proved to be unscientific. Moreover, the text historical method cannot provide answers to questions of meaning or aesthetic appreciation. In other words, it sets aside philosophy for the fetishism of realia, often under the guise of a critical attitude. So realia meaning the real historical facts concealed within text. But whereas this approach provides a chronology, often speculative and relative, philosophical approaches provide an interpretation in the form of an argument. What is the systematic principle that provides a way to appreciate the Itihasa Purana tradition? One, the Itihasa Purana tradition is an interpretive tradition. What does it interpret? The Veda. Two, what is the simple guiding principle for this interpretation? It is Brahmavada or ontology. Advaita has many aspects such as teachers, canons, and schools, both within Advaita and outside. Particularly within Indology, scholars like to present it as a sectarian point of view, one among countless sects teeming within Hinduism. Seen thus, not only do the texts canonical in Hinduism not possess a unity, one would hardly like to grant that Advaita itself is a coherent, though not dogmatic tradition. Other scholars present Advaita as a science or as a philosophical school, but hardly anyone thinks of Advaita as a method. But consider the verse, Itihasa Puranabhyam Vedam Samupa Brahmaye. Stated otherwise, Itihasa Purana is a literary aesthetic interpretation of the revelation of Brahman in the Veda. Inasmuch as Advaita provides a logical argument for the same purpose, elucidation of Brahman or Brahma Mimamsa, there is no reason to discount Advaita as providing a logical method for understanding the Itihasa Purana tradition. In this way, our reading of these texts becomes more meaningful. Inasmuch as philology or the study of text ought to pursue understanding text rather than speculate from a pseudo-scientific perspective, Advaita rather than text historicism provides a better method for philology. In the remainder of this paper, we shall investigate the intersection of the Mahabharata and the Bhagavata Purana as interpretations of the Veda. In order not to lose sight of the aesthetic dimension of these texts, we have chosen to pay close attention to Ananda or ecstatic bliss. Because Ananda is Brahman's true nature, we see how the text connects the literary ecstasy of the text with its very source, Brahman. With these comments on method and the history of the field, let us now turn to the text itself, or to the texts themselves. Okay. This is the introduction, and it is setting up the contrast between Advaita and text historicism. Advaita is normally taken to be a school or a tradition, and text historicism the only scientific method for studying that tradition. Here we're taking a different perspective and saying Advaita may be a school, may be a set of teachers, but it is first and foremost a method of hermeneutics, of Mimamsa. It is Brahma Mimamsa as opposed to Karma Mimamsa. The inquiry into bliss. Both the Brahma Sutras and the Bhagavata Purana begin with a statement of the central theme of the text, Brahman. The Brahma Sutras begin with Athato Brahma Jignasa Janmadyasya Yataha. Hence, thereafter, a deliberation on Brahman is to be undertaken. That Brahman from which are derived the birth, etc. of this universe. The Bhagavata Purana begins with Janmadyasya Yataha. While the former text is a logical one, Yukti, the latter is an aesthetic, ecstatic text describing itself thus. The Bhagavata is the fruit of the wish-fulfilling tree of, there's a typo there, of the wish-fulfilling tree of Vedic literature. It is like the nectar flowing from the mouth of Shuka. Addressing its readers, the text says, Aho, O connoisseurs of aesthetic experience, O experts in poetic moods, while in this world, drink continuously the spiritual flavors of the Bhagavata to your full satisfaction. The Bhagavata Purana is thus an ecstatic text. Despite the declaration that both texts are about Brahman, the source of creation, etc. of the universe, the texts appear to have little in common. Is not the meticulous, inexorable logic of the Brahma Sutras opposed to the passion of the Purana? What does sobriety have to do with ecstasy? To understand this, let us follow the cue of the author of these texts. Tradition attributes the Brahma Sutras and the Bhagavata Purana to Rishi Vyasa, who appears in the Mahabharata as its author. We can be uncultured historical realists and raise the common sense question about a historical figure capable of authoring such a text. The solutions to the Vyasa question produce risible results. What is history if not dead facts embedded in narratives which are not self-conscious of their own constructed character? Fortunately, We can also approach textual traditions thoughtfully and try to see what this eponymous tradition of Vyasa is indicating. Let us trace this tradition to its inception in the Mahabharata. In the outermost frame of the text, before commencing the recitation of the epic, the narrator tells his audience, Itihasa Purana Bhyam Vedam Samupabhramye. The textual tradition, whether logical or ecstatic, is primarily interpretive. Thus, the Mahabharata presents itself as the fifth Veda and attributes its composition to Vyasa, who is also the editor of the Veda, the primary revelation. The Brahma Sutras are also explicitly attributed to Badarayana, an epithet of Vyasa's. Again, once we set aside Jejun historicism, we see that the Brahma Sutras are a carefully ordered system of aphorisms constructed and grouped as a logical interpretive matrix of the Veda. And the Bhagavata Purana, as we saw, is the nectar of the fruit of the tree of Vedic literature, self-consciously fashioned as an ecstatic interpretation of Upanishadic Brahman. Not only is the Bhagavata Purana explicit that Krishna is the supreme Brahman revealed in the Veda, it is also quite aware of the various systems of philosophy, harmonizing them with Upanishadic Brahman. The ecstatic text is not unphilosophical, propounding blind sectarian faith, nor is the sobriety of the Brahma Sutras unaware of ecstasy. In fact, following its initial 5 topics settling the ontology and textual grounds for inquiry into Brahman, the philosophical text begins again with an inquiry into bliss. Ananda Maya Adhikaranam. So this is the Adhikarana, the name of the sutras that follow, the section title. In this section, you have seen that whereas it is fashionable to oppose Bhagavata to Brahma Sutras and to say that Indians are uncritical for attributing all these texts to Vyasa, there is actually a common thread. So the Vyasa question refers to the Homeric question, which was raised in classical philology, that there was not one poet called Homer who could have written the Iliad and the Odyssey, but it must have been a committee, a collaboration, various historical recensions, and so on. A similar question was raised about the Mahabharata and the Puranas in Indology, but here we see that Vyasa is the name for a common thread, a common interpretive approach that runs through all these texts. And we cannot oppose the Bhagavata as an irrational, sectarian, religious text to Brahma Sutras as philosophy, because they are linked by the common theme of Ananda, which is the goal of all philosophy. The Bhagavata Purana begins with 3 verses of benediction, praising 1, the supreme truth, which is the cause of creation, sustenance, and dissolution of the universe, and the source of revelation. 2, the Bhagavata text, and 3, its readers. These 3 verses also disclose the 4 features of any Shastra. Adhikari, the qualified student, here it is the devotees. Vishaya, subject matter, that is the supreme truth and the relationship to Saguna Brahman through bhakti. Prayojana, result, which is Atyantika Dukkha Nivriti, complete cessation of sorrow, and Paramananda Prapti, attainment of supreme happiness in the form of complete surrender to Bhagavan, and Sambandha, the relationship between Adhikara, Vishaya, and Prayojana. The outer frame of the narrative is introduced in the 4th verse. It is the Naimisha forest, where Shaunaka and his companion rishis are engaged in a sacrifice lasting 1,000 years. The entire Bhagavatam unfolds in the conversation between these sages and the Suta Ugrashravas, the son of Romaharshana. In the last chapter of the first Skandha, the Suta introduces the narrator Shuka, the son of Vyasa, who narrates the Bhagavatam proper to King Parikshit. This king is Arjuna's grandson and the sole survivor of the Kurus after the great battle, but he has been cursed to die by snake bite in a week. This is the second frame. In the 12th Skandha, chapter 5.13, Shuka completes his narrative and closes out the inner frame. The Suta narrates the remaining 8 chapters of this final Skandha and closes out the outer frame. The literary architecture of the Bhagavata Purana engulfs the Mahabharata in stunning ways. The narrative site occupied by the text is the same as the epics, Naimisha forest, and the narrators and their respective audiences are also the same. Both texts explicitly attribute authorship to Vyasa, and both texts describe the same Brahman, Narayana. The Bhagavatam knows the Mahabharata intimately and shares not only an author and characters with it, but also the design of its embedded narratives. The outer frame of both texts is the same, whereas the inner frame is modified in interesting ways. Instead of Vyasa's student Vaishampayana, we have Vyasa's son Shuka narrating the inner frame. The audience and the setting of this inner frame contain interesting inversions. Whereas the Bhagavata Purana is narrated to Parikshit when he is about to die of snake bite, the Mahabharata's inner frame is narrated to the dead king's son, King Janamejaya, at the sacrifice of the snakes. Thus, the Bhagavatam is conscious of itself as a successor to the Mahabharata. It is presented as if narrated much earlier than the first narration of the epic. I underscore these points to demonstrate the playful genius at work in these compositions. The frame narratives, for example, are no mere additions by later redactors. By the time of the Bhagavata's composition, whenever that may have been, the Mahabharata has already established itself as a paradigm of ecstatic literature. The conclusions of the so-called text historical method, which seeks to explain the history of a text by disregarding its literary unity, would then be even less credible in the case of this Purana than the Mahabharata. So now I come to the connection between literature and ecstasy. The Gopis' erotic mystical dance with Bhagavan Krishna is well known as a representation of the highest ecstasy a soul can experience. But what is the connection between literature and ecstasy? Plato says, none of the epic poets, if they're good, are masters of their subject. They are inspired, possessed, and that is how they utter all these beautiful poems. The same goes for lyric poets if they're good. Just as the Corybantes are not in their right minds when they dance, lyric poets too are not in their right minds when they make those beautiful lyrics. But as soon as they sail into harmony and rhythm, they are possessed by Bacchic frenzy. Just as Bacchus worshippers, when they are possessed, draw honey and milk from rivers, but not when they are in their right minds, the soul of a lyric poet does this too, as they say themselves. Not only poetry, but also philosophy is dedicated to this god of ecstasy. There are indeed, as those concerned with the mysteries say, many who carry the thyrsus, but the true Bacchants are few. The thyrsus is the staff, the religious symbol of the Bacchants. These latter are, in my opinion, no other than those who have practiced philosophy in the right way. Even in language, a divine madness plays a role. In both name and achievement, madness from a god is finer than self-control of human origin, according to the testimony of the ancient language givers. It takes a tender, virgin soul and awakens it to a Bacchic frenzy of songs and poetry that glorifies the achievements of the past and teaches them to future generations. This is all Plato, by the way. Ecstasy in the Platonic idiom is a mania, a divine madness higher than sophistic sobriety or human skill. The vocabulary of initiation, possession, madness, frenzy, and inspiration underscore Plato's erotic view of philosophical literature. No wonder then that he finds writing rather than live discourse problematic. His dialogues, though written, maintain the quality of a live conversation, a narration. Although writing remains the medium by which great literature is preserved, it could also turn literature into dead material, realia. Compared with Socrates' inspired erotic philosophical speech about the ascent of the soul to behold pure being, Plato provides a counterexample. Socrates says, actually, you'll find that it's just like the epigram people say is inscribed on the tomb of Midas. It goes like this. A maid of bronze am I, on Midas's tomb I lie. As long as water flows and trees grow tall, shielding the grave where many come to cry, that Midas rests, here I say to one and all. This epigram is considered an example of a badly composed poem by Socrates because you can switch around the order of the lines. It will work no matter which line you take first, which one you take next, and which one you take last. Let us recapitulate our argument. The Rasa Leela in the Bhagavata Purana raised the question of the ecstatic potential of literature. To theoretically thematize it, we introduced Plato's assessment of mania in its relation to the act of participating in literature as well as experiencing a rapturous overcoming of the embodied everyday self. The point here is not whether bhakti is the same as divine mania. That question is historical and misses the point. Rather, in the very conceptualization of the terms such as philosophy and philology by Plato, we find a warning, namely that literature contains a communication of something alive, enlivening, enlightening, and sacred. It should not forsake such communication, the very basis of pedagogy, for the sake of dead things, epitaphs and epigraphs of persons and things, i.e. for realia. So our philology, what we now practice as philology in the academy, and we oppose to the irrational, exuberant views of the devotees or of the traditional reading communities of the Bhagavatam, our philology is actually just a kind of necrophilia, an obsession with realia, and we have forgotten the true meaning of both philosophy and philology, which is to philosophy is to enable the soul to ascend, and philology is to enable this mania. In reading the intersection between the Mahabharata and the Bhagavata Purana, we are following what I termed ecstatic philology, or the erotic element with which this tradition narrates itself to itself as if in a joyful procession. But what or who leads this procession? What is the source of this ecstasy so faithfully transmitted in these literary creations? Again, we turn to Plato's genius to guide us. So the thought here is that if we look at these texts from a modern historicizing perspective, then we will say, well, they have different authors, they are hundreds of years apart, they're centuries apart, different parts of them seem different, they don't fit together. We will get the sense that the Indian tradition is just a congeries of elements. However, if we pay attention to the thought being related, we see that there is one guiding thought and one source that is actually enabling the entire textual tradition, its evolution. In the symposium, Diotima reveals to Socrates the erotic connection between creativity and its source, beauty. After warning him that he may find it difficult to be initiated into the final and highest mystery, literally, this is the final vision of initiation, she nevertheless teaches him. The lover is led through appreciating the beauty of the body, of laws and customs, and finally to the beauty of knowledge. Here the lover turns from instances of beauty to the great ocean of beauty, and gazing upon it becomes gloriously creative and brings forth beautiful ideas in the plenteous crop of philosophy. When a man has been thus far tutored in the lore of love, passing from view to view of beautiful things in the right and regular ascent, suddenly he will have revealed to him, as he draws to the close of his dealings in love, a wondrous vision, beautiful in its nature, and this, Socrates, is the final object of all those previous toils. First of all, it is ever existent and neither comes to be nor perishes, neither waxes nor wanes. The source of all creativity and beauty is that which is ever existent, or simply being. Plato describes it as the true, the good, and the beautiful. When we turn to the Itihasa Purana tradition of narratives and the festivals and rituals based on this tradition, we can also see the deep connection between ontology and ecstasy, or rather the relationship between Brahman and Bhakti. Bhakti is not ecstatic because it is irrational, or because it is a creed, or because it is social dynamics, as Durkheim has it. Bhakti is not ecstatic because it is transgressive. Bhakti is ecstatic because it is the experience of the unconditioned source. It is ecstatic precisely because it is a liminal experience, dehising from, that means detaching from, though without negating the order of subjectivity and social constructions. The textual tradition always understood itself as oriented by the revelation of Brahman, not only as existence and consciousness, but also as bliss. Shankara writes, "For it is in reference to the Supreme Self alone that the word bliss is repeated many times. After introducing the blissful one and speaking of him as bliss in the text, he is bliss to be sure, it is stated, for one becomes happy by coming in contact with bliss. Who indeed would inhale or exhale if this bliss were not there in the supreme space within the heart? For this one indeed delights people. This is an evaluation of bliss. He attains the self full of bliss. The enlightened man is not afraid of anything after realizing the bliss of Brahman, and he knew bliss as Brahman." In another Upanishad also, the word bliss is seen to be used for Brahman itself in the sentence, knowledge, bliss, Brahman. The argument that Shankara is referring to Nirguna Brahman and not Saguna Brahman, whereas the Purana speaks of Krishna as the Lord, is irrelevant to the current discussion, because both the Brahma Sutras and the Bhagavata Purana begin the inquiry into Brahman with the phrase Janma Dyasya, or the source of creation, etc. of this universe. Shankara prefaces his interpretation of the Anandamayadhikaranam by raising an objection. It has been established with the help of logic that the Upanishadic texts aim at proving that the omniscient and omnipotent God is the cause of the origin, continuance, and dissolution of the universe. And by asserting that the same kind of knowledge is gathered from all the Upanishads, it has been explained that all the Upanishads speak of a conscious entity as the cause. What then is the idea of proceeding with the remaining portion of the book? He responds to the objection he has raised by claiming that Brahman is known in two aspects, with the delimitations of name and form and without them, leading to different means of liberation, mediated, krama mukti, and immediate, sadhyo mukti. From a logical, ontological, and theological point of view, then, it does not hesitate to make room for the Bhagavata Purana's vision, and the Purana reciprocally concurs with the Upanishadic revelation of Brahman. Krishna is bliss personified. Okay. I will now read literacy ecstasy in the Bhagavatam. Before we proceed with our argument, let us provide some evidence that the Bhagavata Purana is indeed concerned with transmitting an experience of literary ecstasy. We do not need to look far. The stories of Hari are nectarine. They destroy the sins of Kali Yuga and purify the narrator, interlocutor, and the listeners. His deeds in various incarnations are delightful to the ear. They remove impurities of the mind and cultivate purity, devotion, and friendliness. Even the liberated trees ask that their speech be ever engaged in the narration of the attributes of the Lord, while Nanda and his Gopas delight in narratives of Krishna and become joyful, overcome the limitations of embodied existence, and experience bliss. This is as literally as one can conceptualize ecstasy. The creator Brahma admits that the unconquerable Lord is captivated by those devoted to the Lord through reciting his stories. These stories cultivate understanding and devotion. When Krishna leapt into the lake to subdue the poisonous Kaliya serpent, the gopis restrained his distressed mother from following him and, fixed in grief like corpses, consoled themselves with stories of the beloved of Raja. Those women who had never seen Krishna were already captivated by listening to his tales. At the conclusion of the mystical ecstatic rasa dance, Shuka recommends that an intelligent person, listening with faith to the narratives of Vishnu's play, conquer lust and other diseases of the heart and attain supreme devotion, which the text explicitly says is the highest philosophy. The gopis who dance with Krishna surprisingly describe their experience as an ecstatic enactment of the Lord's delightful narrative. Later, when Krishna leaves for Mathura, Uddhava consoles the love-stricken gopis by singing the stories of Krishna Leela. In an aside to the listener-reader, Uddhava remarks that for one who has developed an appreciation for these narratives, even birth as a creator god is less engaging. He worships the dust of the feet of the gopis who had danced in this literary ecstatic dance, repeating that these songs and stories purify the three worlds. The Bhagavatam is thus fully aware of and masterfully deploys the ecstatic erotic power of literature for its salvific philosophical potential. We could easily extend the list of passages which demonstrate the Purana's self-consciousness as an ecstatic salvific text. In the 10th skanda alone, I won't read all the numbers, but these lists are sophistic exercises and remind us what philology ought not to be. Reading reduced to scavenging for realia. Plato mocks this tendency as mere cleverness and rough ingenuity. The true task of philology is to read narratives for self-knowledge. The Bhagavata Purana explicitly warns against a crude historicizing approach. Shuka says, "O great king, I have narrated to you the stories of many who lived to make their names famous in their lifetime and then to pass away and become a memory or a mere name soon after. These narratives are only the literary device I have used with a view to instill into you the importance of renunciation and realization. They have no ultimate significance in themselves or are not to be taken as literal facts." The sutta closing out the outer frame also concurs. Narratives that deal with temporal facts alone are ultimately false and dead, but those that deal with the truth are auspicious and purifying, blissful, ever charming, and an eternal intellectual feast. What truth is this? The truth that from which this universe obtains its birth, etc., as stated in both Brahma Sutra. This is a typo, it should be 1.1.2, and Bhagavata Purana 1.1.1. Now we come to ecstasy and textuality in the Bhagavatam. Ecstasy and textuality are explicitly linked in the Bhagavata Purana. Can I just ask how much time I have, Anuradhaji?
You have another 25 minutes.
Okay, so let me just check. Ecstasy and textuality in the Bhagavatam we shall finish. And then we will skip the Shishupala sections. As I mentioned, Professor Adluri has lectured elsewhere on them. So this is a more developed version of it. But we will then go to the conclusion. So we're going to be well in time. Ecstasy and textuality are explicitly linked in the Bhagavata Purana. Shuka, who is himself liberated, admits that the sages who are established in the absolute without attributes rejoice in singing the excellences of Hari. The Mahabharata also knows this joyfulness. Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, with minds fixed on me, with lives dedicated to me, enlightening each other and always speaking of me, they derive satisfaction and rejoice. Krishna repeats the sentiment in the Bhagavata Purana, adding that such conversations are a means to bhakti. The gopis not only experience ecstasy when dancing with Krishna, but also by singing Krishna Leela. On his visit to Vraja, Uddhava rejoices recollecting the deeds of Krishna with the gopis. Even before they laid eyes on him, the Brahmana women who feed Krishna had heard of his glories. Rukmini decides to marry Krishna upon hearing of his beauty, prowess, and glories sung at her father's home. All these are instances of the erotic potential of inspired narrative. The Bhagavata Purana is transparent about the joy of narration and works with the narrative of Brahman to induce bliss in the listener. In the final skanda, as Shuka begins to wrap up his narration to Parikshit, he reveals the nature of what he has just recounted. So this quote actually appeared previously, so I won't read it, but I will read 15 again, or rather 15 we have not read. Those who aspire to have pure and undiluted devotion to Krishna should constantly hear about the sin-destroying acts and excellences of Krishna, sung or chanted or discoursed upon by great devotees. Let them hear that alone, ever and anon. After Shuka finishes narrating, Suta resumes the narrative. He recounts how Parikshit dies from the bite of the great snake Takshaka and how his son Janamejaya performed the snake sacrifice to avenge his father's death. The sacrifice where Vyasa's Mahabharata was narrated. Since Vyasa is the editor of the Veda and the author of the Itihasa Purana, Suta pulls together the textual tradition beginning with the unarticulated primordial sound, the manifestation of Om, which in turn reveals its source, the all-pervading Paramatman. Systematically, the letters of the alphabet and the teachings of the Veda are transmitted through teachers. Vyasa compiled the Vedas into 4 texts according to meter. Then come about the recensions such as Taittiriya, etc. Last to appear are the Puranas, in which Vyasa's student Vaishampayana and Suta himself play important roles in the transmission. The narrative then takes up the ultimate challenge of cosmic dissolution and forgetting by narrating the Markandeya episode. Then, in spite of the entropic power of time, the decline of yugas, the narrative of the textual tradition continues by recapitulating in a summary form the 12 skandhas of the Bhagavata Purana. In this manner, the textual tradition transcends both an original text and an author whose authority is based on his own subjective consciousness and creativity. Rather, an originary force, coeval with both the emanation of the universe and the textual tradition, provides ontological, epistemological, and aesthetic moorage to the Itihasa Purana. Let us restate Plotinus's insight in the Itihasa Purana's idiom. Shrishti is emanation from the source, the one, whereas bhakti is the erotic, ecstatic return. When Suta wraps up his narrative, he draws attention to the erotic power of Krishna's narratives, which can inspire us beyond ephemeral materiality. The literary productions in which there is no place for the worshipful Lord, the master of all the senses, but deal with only worldly men and matters, are devoid of truth and are ephemeral. On the contrary, such works as reveal the glory of God manifesting through all life and nature. They promote what is true, what is good, and what is holy. It is that literature which sparkles with the excellences of the divine that remains ever novel in its power to delight and charm the mind. It alone can sustain the mind always as in a festive mood and dry up the ocean of samsara in which man is plunged. However attractive might be the literary beauties of a writing, poem, or song, if it is devoid of all references to and expositions of Sri Hari's world-sanctifying excellences, it is like a mud puddle which attracts only crows and never the swans. Holy men eschew them, for they care only for where the Lord is and for what reveals his presence. It is such compositions as are embellished by the names of the Lord, the infinite being, which reveal his holy fame and destroy men's sins, that saintly personages here expound and recite, even if there be mistakes in every line of such text. So this is the very counter to so-called critical philology, which is focused only on taking apart the text. Ecstatic philology does not separate ontology, theology, and anthropology in the literal sense of the term. Every Indian philosophical system has some form of salvific goal. That goal is presented as bhakti, or the literal rapture obtained from a literary rapture, the Krishna Leela. This is possible because the text under discussion pays heed to that which is emergent, janmadi, the capacity of the source to well up in the present and transport us, rather than an origin which has been sublated or of mere antiquarian interest. We shall later explore the ontological origin of ecstatic joy in the being that transcends beings, Brahman, whose very nature, Swarupa Lakshana, is bliss, Ananda. Ecstatic philology and philologische Wissenschaft pursue different goals. The former moves our soul and is thus akin to poetry, the latter is devoted to what is dead. As I explained, we will not read the concrete interpretation of the Shishupala episode because that is the longest portion of the paper and is not concerned with the methodological point. So that goes through Shishupala, it goes through the Vedic predecessors, precursors in the story of Shunashepa. We will now come to the conclusion. How much time is left?
We have about, we have around 20 minutes.
Okay, so I did quite well. We will come to the conclusion and the rest of the time will be open for questions, or we can go back and look at specific passages if anyone wishes. Let us conclude with a few remarks on the comparison between Advaita and the text historical method by turning to one of its chief proponents, Paul Harker. In the Encyclopedia of Indian Philosophies, Karl Potter writes, Harker and Maeda propose the following texts, all of which are satisfied by the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, by common consent, the work of the Shankara we are interested in. Use of the term avidya to mean superimposition, adhyasa, and not as synonymous with such terms as jada, bhava-rupa, avarana, or vikshepa shakti, or anirvachaniya, which identifications Harker and Maeda find non-Shankaran. Use of the term nama-rupa to mean the original world stuff, like Sankhya's prakriti. Relatively infrequent use of the term maya in comparison with avidya. Frequent occurrence of the term Ishvara, it is found less frequently in later Advaitins, including Shankara's pupils. Reluctance or refusal to accept Ananda as a positive property of Brahman. And 6, non-occurrence of the term Vivarta in its illusionistic sense as the relation between a cause and its only apparent unreal effect. Maeda borrows these criteria uncritically from Harker, and Karl Potter enters them beautifully in his encyclopedia. Govind Chandra Pandey in Life and Thought of Shankaracharya effectively argues against Harker's criteria, but does not go so far as to critique the text historical approach itself. If we look at criterion 5, we find that Shankara's Brahma Sutra Bhashya on Anandadikaranam does not contradict, but rather supports the Bhagavata Purana's presentation of Krishna as bliss, even as the Taittiriya Upanishad says, Raso Vai Saha. So I will stop the share there, so that you can see me in full. And Professor Adluri is here, so I will move over and he will be able to take your questions. Would you like to come here?
No. One of the questions that I have, Professor Adluri and Joydeep ji, as I gathered, I think you made many interesting many insightful points in comparison between the Brahma Sutra and the Bhagavata Purana. The most important of them being how the Bhagavata Purana gives us a bhakti tradition which takes us to the same goal of moksha, same goal of Atma Jnana that the Brahma Sutra is speaking. in that way, it is truly the Itihasa Purana, the Mahabharata, this tradition are reinterpreting the Veda, or or reformulating or making the Vedic goal available for everyone, because there are certain eligibility criteria for Veda Dhyana, but there is no such criteria for Itihasa Purana, and everybody can. So I found this very interesting. But my question is it the is it my understanding correct that what you are arguing is that the Itihasa Purana, the question of what portion of it is historical, what portion of it metaphorical, these are all, the ultimate analysis is of no import. It's useless. The what actually matters is.
I would not say, just let me butt in, I would not say it is of no import. It is of a lot of negative import. Also, it does not satisfy its own criteria for scientificity. Measuring whether a textual interpretation in a tradition or a community occurred 100 years before Christ or 100 years after Christ, the distance from Christ is not illuminating in any way, right? But it also blocks off an access, right? This method cuts the text away from its life in its community and drags it as a dead object to be autopsied, to be dissected. So, so I have a problem with that.
As I understand,
finally, the explanation will not be an explanation of how the text created a community which belongs to the text, and how the community preserved and celebrated that text. It's a live thing, and I think the central term here, Joy is going to yell at me for using it, is enactment. The enactment of the Vedic wisdom through joy, through ananda.
What the powerful idea I found is that the texts are real to us, the Itihasa Purana, because of the emanation, because of the manifestation of Vishwa in them. So that is what makes the text real.
Yes, that's the central idea. And if you look at the Greek example also, Plato says whether X poet said it or Y poet said it is irrelevant, because when the poet is speaking as a human, what they're saying is trivial. So you can only record it as X poet and Y poet about trivial statements when they're speaking in that rush of inspiration, when they're speaking through divine mania. It is the same truth that is manifesting through them. And that's the central idea of this paper. The same truth manifests through the Brahma Sutras, through the Mahabharata, through the Purana tradition. It is one continuous tradition. And when we refuse to acknowledge that origin of all these texts in Brahman, and that the same bliss is coursing through all these texts, then we come up with pseudo questions such as, could a person like Vyasa have actually written 18 Mahapuranas, right? Could all parts of the Puranas be from the same period, from the same author? As the Indian texts tell us over and over again, these questions about dead authors, dead facts, they're completely meaningless.
Thank you. Anuradha ji, you can ask other questions.
Yeah, we have some questions. There's one question from Kanchan Gogate. He's saying, do you call ecstatic philology a method? Would you be able to describe literary theory and criticism?
It is clearly a method. It's being proposed as an alternative method. So for the last 200 to 300 years, the word critique was taken over from the French and taken over by Germans. Initially, it was spelled in the French way, and then they spelled it in the German way. And all philology, all philosophy was to be critical. And by critical, it really meant factual, deadening, historical, right? So it became a kind of necrophilia, an obsession with dead people and dead facts. And it lost that creative, spontaneous aspect that is really the essence of the humanities. The opposite to that kind of critical philology, which is practiced by old men on the verge of death, is a kind of young, youthful, ecstatic philology. If Krishna were to propound a philology, it would be ecstatic philology. And he does. I mean, let's be honest, that's the philology he propounds.
So one of the key things that is driving this essay that we did not get a chance to put in is Krishna's advice that these texts should not be shared with anybody who's not suhrid and does not and has in their heart anasuya bhava and asuya bhava. And what is that asuya bhava? Asuya bhava is that feeling that, oh, was this text written 500 years after Christ or earlier than Christ, right? So you are already coming with a sort of a comparative theology with an evangelical bent to the text. So yeah, ecstatic philology is enacted as bhakti. So it is those narratives that I hear about Krishna that create joy in me that is enacted during my temple worship, let us say. Or it is that joy that I recognize even in my Nirguna Brahmopasana.
Of course, a lot of people have asked whether this paper is publicly available. Is it published or can they access it?
So it will be published relatively soon, within the next 6 months, and then I will upload it to academia.edu. So if you follow Professor Adluri, if you know his profile on academia.edu, you can just Google it if you don't know. It should give you a message that it has been uploaded.
Mr. Parthasarathi wants to know what is the difference between inference and influence according to Advaita Vedanta. Can you clarify?
Could you repeat the question, please? I'm sorry.
It is, what is the difference between inference and influence according to Advaita Vedanta?
I do not know about influence, but if you are talking about inference strictly in the technical sense of pramana, we accept anumana in Advaita philosophy. So I mean Advaita as a method or a systematic method which has some logical basis. And that logical basis is the revelation of Brahman in the Veda, especially the Upanishad. And that is also given in different terms. For example, Vijnanamanandam Brahma or Prajnanam Brahma, etc. But what Shankaracharya is clear on is that by Vedic revelation of Brahman, what we mean is the Jiva Brahma Ekatvavada. That Brahman is my own self, and therefore I can neither accept it because it's my own self, what's there to accept, nor can I reject it, and nor can I contradict it. And therefore that serves as the first principle on which an interpretive method or an interpretive system can be developed. Whereas in the text historical method, it depends on my misunderstanding. So if I see something that doesn't make sense to me, I call it an interpolation or a contradiction even. And so when you bring up when you make a system of your own ignorance or misunderstanding as a method, naturally the text historical method went pretty badly.
There's Srinivas Rauji wants to know, why do we have to depend upon Western writers like Karl Potter? Do you have any comment on that?
You don't have to depend on them exclusively, but you should know whatever literature is out there to be able to use it or respond to it.
Any other question?
Yeah, I think there's one more question which says, he wants to know, I mean, he's making a suggestion, Indrani ji is making a suggestion that there is a handbook for, I think they want you to come with a handbook for approaching the reading of ancient texts, you know. Is that something?
Professor Adluri's hard drive is full of papers on the Mahabharata, full of notes on Brahma Sutra, full on Hindu revelation. I had actually proposed a book called Vyasa's World, which I thought was a great catchy title. I had proposed it to Penguin India, and I thought it was short, little snippets from his notebooks on Mahabharata, on Vyasa, on Hinduism, Bhakti, on literary criticism. And I proposed this book with a nice proposal, and we waited months and they declined. So the material is out there. We just have to find a way to popularize it and publish it. In fact, he has a website. We decided finally it would go live on the website instead of as a published book. It's going to be, I think there are 54 entries. So on the website over a period of 54 weeks, 1 year, every week, there's going to be a new little snippet, and then there's going to be a discussion on it. So I will share maybe through Indica, through the list, I will share the address for the website.
We're looking forward to it.
Did anybody feel any kind of ecstasy or bliss or joy or a thrill?
I did.
Yes, we did. You know, the connection that the Brahma Sutra's Ananda is the same as the Bhagavata's Ananda was an eye-opener, because sometimes we think the Bhagavata Ananda is something else and the Brahma Sutra Ananda is Ananta actually. So, people try to separate it, but you very beautifully
explained. Even someone who is not an Advaitin and is against Advaita, for example, the Prabhupada, who belongs to the Gaudiya tradition, even he says that the Bhagavata Purana itself is a commentary on Brahma Sutras, because that's the whole point, is that the logic is there as a safety net to hold us up as we become ecstatic, so that our ecstasy is not a vulgar ecstasy or a misleading ecstasy. It's not a Vishayananda. It will all the time, when I read the Bhagavatam, the Ananda will be Brahmananda or Paramananda. So it's a very beautiful community of text containing within it nourishing and educating communities, and having a live relationship with those communities. And when you discount all of that and just take the text and put it on the table and say, oh, this one text does not satisfy my 5 criteria, what you're doing is meaningless and violent.
There's one more question about Harker's criterion, or criteria rather.
Yeah, please.
So the published version of this paper will have a more detailed engagement with Harker. We didn't share that with reading here because, people, it's too early in the morning for you to deal with someone who is sort of caviling and unhappy and miserable, and you might as well begin the morning with the feast of Bhagavata and Ananda and with happy people. Surround yourself with happy people. But the published version of it will have this very unhappy man's criticisms and his bogus criteria. But until that time, if you wish to know more about Paul Harker, on academia.edu on Professor Adluri's profile, there's a paper called Methods in the Study of Religion. Don't quote me on the title, but go to his profile and you will find the paper. It is extensively about Harker, and it is a biography and bibliography of Harker. And you will see where he's coming from. He's coming from a certain polemical tradition in Christianity. He's coming from a tradition that is not sympathetic to the intellectual richness of Hinduism. And he's applying this text historical method to dismantle its intellectual traditions. And there's a lot of sort of resentment and anti-Judaism and other kinds of things in that paper also that you should look at. So it'll give you a background in Paul Harker.
You will want to type the name of the...
Yeah, there's one more question, which is from an anonymous author, viewer, and he says, are there commonalities between this and American indigenous societies in terms of oral traditions having more meaning than dead text?
Please make no mistake, the Bhagavata may pretend to be oral, right? Performatively oral, but it is a clearly written text. Especially in the case of Mahabharata, we know that that the manuscripts have been preserved too carefully and belong to a custodial tradition. So when we say orality, yes, there are some issues, that some positive things about orality, such as the role it plays in transmission and the role it plays in teaching. So when a teacher teaches a student, it is live. But the text is meant to be studied also by people who have no access to a teacher. They should also make sense, right? So the written form is quite important. If we remember that, oral tradition and so on. But what I like to show a commonality with American indigenous tradition is the utter deremption, right? How they were excluded from a world historical narrative that was Eurocentric. And they try to do the same thing with Indian thought as well. So there the commonality, of course, comes through.
There's a further commonality I would mention, because there is a comment from Plato. He says it's in the laws that there are no writings on this subject by me. This is something that is transmitted from a teacher to a student, and like a flash inside him, it lights up. So these are certainly traditions that have to be communicated from a teacher to a student. And that mode of transmission, although you may use a written text as an accessory, that mode A makes sure the understanding is transmitted. B, it also preserves the tradition, because the teacher is not teaching someone who is not interested in the subject, is sort of bitter about the subject, is, looking to befoul the text. So that preserves a certain continuity of the transmission within people receptive to that knowledge. And in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna also says, you must never relate this to someone who is without faith in me, and so on and so forth. So these texts are quite aware of the need that as sacred texts have to be guarded and only passed on within a certain community of receptive souls.
Thank you so much, Vishwaji and Joydeep. You mentioned Raso Vai Saha in your talk, and really this was a Rasanubhava for us to see the commonality between Brahma Sutra and Bhagavata, and the Ananda. The underpinning is Ananda alone and nothing else, and the really Brahmananda. And we are really blessed. Only time is not on our side. We could have got more of this Ananda. Time, unfortunately, is playing spoil sport, and we wish to see you more of these discussions at some later stage. Thank you so much.
It's already written up mostly, as you can see, so it won't be lost. It will be published soon. So
thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Namaste. Thank you.
Thanks again for the speakers for this wonderful session. We have more programs for you tomorrow. I'll make an announcement on that. Okay, so we have a talk on the thought chains in the Gita in the light of Sri Shankara Bhagavadpada's Bhashya. This is by Jayaraman Mahadevan, and this talk is going to be in Sanskrit. And I think the speaker will later provide a translation in English. So please do tune in. This is at 7 a.m. tomorrow, India time. Thank you so much and good night.